I think that Starmer's made a good step, but we need a real debate in our country about what is an independent British foreign policy like. We don't want to fall out with America, but we should stop being a poodle, as lots of people call it, always going with America come what may.
The Prime Minister is also facing criticism from his predecessor, Sir Tony Blair. The former PM is reported as saying that Starmer should have backed America against Iran from the very beginning. And speaking to Sky's Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips, the Foreign Secretary, Yvette Cooper, she hit back.
There are some people in politics who think that we should always agree with the US, whatever. There are other people in politics who think we should never take action with the US, again, whatever the circumstances. I don't think either of those positions is in the UK national interest, and it is the responsibility for Keir Starmer to act in the UK's national interest for British citizens. I think the point is to make sure that actually we learn the lessons from some of the things that went wrong in Iraq, and I think that is exactly what Keir Starmer's done.
Yvette Cooper there, lining up pretty clearly on the side of her present leader and Prime Minister against her past leader and Prime Minister. We're joined live on the line now by Clare Short, who was a Labour Cabinet Minister under Tony Blair, and she left the Cabinet over the Iraq War. Hello to you, Clare.
Hello.
Welcome to the programme. I'm going to assume that you consider the Prime Minister was right to initially say no to the US use of UK bases for operations against Iranian forces.
I absolutely think that, as does most of the people of Britain. The attack on Iran was, well, look at the chaos it's causing. In the name of helping the people of Iran, we're killing them and destroying their infrastructure. And it's illegal in international law. There's no question about that. So it was wrong, and Keir Starmer was right, and I'm happy to agree with him on this. I don't always agree with him, that to say Britain would not follow America in every mistake America makes.
Yes. And Claire, it has been, you'll have seen the reports, it's been authoritatively reported and not denied by Downing Street that at that important meeting just before the start of the conflict, there was a meeting, and then ministers, including Yvette Cooper, who we just heard, we got the Home Secretary, we had Ed Miliband, we had Angela Rayner. They all stood against the option of saying yes to America, although the Prime Minister reported to have contemplated doing just that and saying yes to that American request. What do you make of that?
Well, my first conclusion is that it's really good to hear that there's open discussion in the Cabinet. There didn't used to be under Tony Blair. You know, if he thought you might disagree, he'd see you first and square you. And the Cabinet wasn't functioning as an open discussion forum. So it's a bit worrying for us all to respond to leaked accounts of something we weren't all at, that says certain people said certain things.
Yeah.
But I think it's healthy that there's a proper discussion in the Cabinet.
So you call that collegiate leadership rather than I guess you could look at it another way and say it's a lack of firm direction from the top. You prefer the former interpretation.
Our constitutional system is meant to depend on cabinet government, and cabinets are the Prime Minister's meant to be primus inter pares, first amongst equals, and he's meant to discuss, he or she, issues with the whole cabinet and come to a collective decision, and then everyone's bound by that decision. And I think otherwise there's no point in having a cabinet. If you give all power to one individual and a few stooges around them in number 10, you'll make a lot of mistakes. And I think we've seen some of that.
Right. So what happens if, and let us hope it does not happen, but what happens if there's an attack on a British installation and British servicemen are hurt or even killed? Does that change the calculation?
It doesn't change it at all. In fact, I think if Britain had agreed to America using our bases, the likelihood of such an attack would have been greater. America's lost 6 members of their armed forces already and numbers injured. So, of course, joining in the war would make our soldiers be more endangered. And I really think it's time for a discussion about what we're doing in bases in the Gulf. What is the role of Britain there? What is the point of Diego Garcia for Britain? What is the point of the base in Cyprus? Is this just to enable the United States to use our bases and we can be a poodle and say, yes, we'll go with you, America? I mean, Britain needs to sort out what our strategy is that's in the interest of Britain. So I think that Starmer's made a good step, but we need a real debate in our country about what is an independent British foreign policy like. We don't want to fall out with America, but we should stop being a poodle, as lots of people call it, always going with America, come what may.
But there are British interests in the Gulf, Clare. Are there not economic interests? There are a lot of Brits there. I mean, what about the case for defending those interests and those people?
Tell me, what are the British interests in the Gulf, please?
Well, there are business interests.
We have described them.
Yeah, we have economic relationships with those Gulf states, amounting to some value.
Well, we have economic relationships with countries all over the world. I mean, we have economic relations, for example, with the Caribbean, and we had Trump bombing boats in the Caribbean. We didn't say we might enter into a war there. I mean, if we are supposed to have military bases everywhere where we've got any economic interests, we'd have to have them all over Europe and all over India and all over anyone we traded with. Anyway, that's a longer term discussion. Right? It's not going to be settled now. But I do think we need a really intelligent, informed discussion about what British foreign policy should be, what is our interest, why have we got all these bases, how much are they costing us? Wouldn't it be better to spend the money on a strong defensive strategy in Europe?
Yes.
And so on.
Oh, you did leave the cabinet on a point of principle over the Iraq war. Not initially. Robin Cook resigned immediately, and so, as I recall, did John Denham. You decided to stay for a while, and eventually you did leave. And now we hear Tony Blair saying it was a mistake on this occasion to refuse to line up with Donald Trump and the US administration. What do you say to your former boss?
I'd say Tony is really losing his way terribly and losing his reputation, not just on... I mean, everyone knows that the Iraq war was a disaster. Tony had a reasonably good reputation until Iraq. Then the country thought he wasn't honest about it. He was determined to go with America, come what may.
Yeah.
The damage to Iraq was very great. It created a new ISIS and a problem of really dangerous terrorism from very extreme forces. And now he's saying Starmer should have done what he did. And it's the one great big mistake he made. So I think this is just very sad and not to be taken seriously.
Well, a rift with the White House, with the President of the United States, that is a serious matter, is it not? I mean, the special relationship, it has been, I don't know, overblown as a concept for a very long time. That doesn't mean it's unimportant.
Harold Wilson famously kept us out of the Vietnam War. There was lots of pressure on him from the United States at that time. Mrs. Thatcher didn't agree with the American invasion of Grenada, a Commonwealth country. I mean, honestly, if having a relationship with the United States means you have to do whatever you're told by Donald Trump, then Britain doesn't have an independent foreign policy and we've become a complete stooge. Of course we have to stand up when America's wrong and it's not in our interest to go with them.
All right, Clare Shaw, good to talk to you. Thank you for joining me on the programme. Now, we can get the thoughts, maybe the counter-thoughts of Tom Baldwin, who's a former Labour advisor and biographer to Keir Starmer. Hello to you, Tom. Welcome.
Hi, John.
Hi, so you were listening there to Clare Shaw, speaking with some passion. What do you say to Clare?
I broadly agree with Clare that Keir Starmer's made the right decision by not agreeing to take part in the initial American attacks on Iran because it was against international law. And Keir Starmer's got a record of this. He is a lawyer and he's one of those people who take international law seriously, I think, along with most people in this country. And in 2003, he wrote an article for The Guardian condemning the likelihood of Britain's involvement in the Iraq war because he said there was no basis for it in international law. He said one argument might be self-defence, but you can't use self-defence because we haven't been attacked. There's no immediate danger of any British bases being attacked. So he says that self-defence would be ludicrous at that point. He's also someone who believes that if you and your allies are attacked, you are, under international law, allowed to take part in military action. And that's what his position has been all the way through. You cite this article in The Spectator talking about what happened in the Security Committee last week. I think your interpretation of it is slightly wrong.
Yeah.
There was never any question of Keir Starmer supporting an offensive US action against Iran. He didn't support it last June. He didn't support it this time because he believes it is against international law. The question which they were considering in that meeting was whether they say to the Americans, however, if our bases and our allies are attacked, then we would be willing to take part in defensive action, whether you say that or whether you wait for a request from America on that basis. So there's been a lot of rather hyperbolic typically hyperbolic reporting around this, with lots of adjectives attached to so-called pacifist Ed Miliband or, dithering Keir Starmer. I think his position's been consistent, clear and principled. And as you say, for once, he appears to be in a position which chimes with that of the British people.
Okay, well, we heard from Downing Street on this very interesting story just in recent days, didn't we? They have not, as far as I could see, denied the story that was reported in The Spectator. They
have actually. They said parts are untrue and the premise of it is untrue. They haven't I think there's some people who wish they'd rather got more involved in this. But once you start getting into kind of ding dong with reporters about what happened in top secret meetings, then you are in danger of disclosing more information. I think that's the view that's taken. So, look, they distanced themselves from it. I think there's detail there which was exaggerated. Once you start attaching adjectives to everybody's motives, then I think it's an opinion piece rather than a piece of reporting.
Okay, so you the version that you have heard from your own sources, it suggests that the Prime Minister never contemplated the idea of Britain agreeing to that cooperation with the United States forces at the outset, at the very beginning.
No, it's a straightforward distinction in international law. It's not like some sort of clever thing. It's, do you want to take part in an offensive action against Iran, or are you only willing to take part in defensive actions? Right? That's pretty straightforward in international law. It's not that complicated, and people have taken a tiny little grain of fact that there was some disagreement about exactly what we tell the Americans, and have built a mountain out of it, and it's as ever, wrapped up with lots and lots of journalistic motives about.
Well, okay, Tom. Since you are helpful in the business of supplying facts where you argue they're needed, what was the disagreement as you understand it? You say it was tiny. What was it?
I think my understanding is the disagreement was about what we tell the Americans at that point.
And what were the differing positions on that, Tom?
Well, there were some people. I wasn't there. I'm not. I've spoken to some people about this, and my understanding is there was some discussion, as is right, as Clare Short says. That's what cabinets are for, to discuss these things in private, rather than the sort of glare of a very, very, very hostile media. The discussion, as I understand it, was whether you say to the Americans, we won't be there for you. We won't be able to use these bases now because we regard it as offensive action. However, if and when our bases are attacked, then yes, obviously we would take part in defensive action. Whether you actually tell them that in advance, or whether you wait for a direct request to come in from the United States of America to use these bases for defensive action. And the decision eventually was taken to wait until that request came in.
All right. And where was Keir Starmer on this?
I think he was one of these people who was saying, well, is there any case for telling the Americans that there is a case for taking action on a defensive grounds? But I wasn't there. Okay. I don't know. What I do know is that the reporting that we've seen is grotesquely exaggerated.
No, you made that point, and it's always grateful to you, Tom, for your perspective on. I'm going to move on and ask you, what do you think about the intervention from Tony Blair that we had at the weekend?
I think it's diminishing. I mean, it's diminishing for him, and I don't think Tony Blair would have taken kindly to a former Labour Prime Minister opining from far away on very, very delicate diplomatic and military operational decisions. Tony Blair has many, many great qualities, but Iraq, there was a case for Iraq, based on actually following international law. He wanted to get George Bush to go to the United Nations and get a second resolution. That was the deal he did, is that if you go to the United Nations for a second resolution, I'll be there with you in the end. I think he's a bad witness to his own motives now, because I think he got pushed into a more and more hardline position. And, some people have learned from the errors of Iraq, not least, if you want to take part in a military action when you don't have a clear plan or clear objectives of what you're actually trying to achieve, which is, I think, the case of the United States of America at the moment. And some people have learned from those mistakes, and some people haven't. And I'm very sad to say that Tony Blair appears to be in the latter camp. And
just last question. I mean, knowing Keir Starmer as you do, does Tony Blair still fill that role of a guiding light for the Prime Minister and trusted advisor?
I don't think he was ever a guiding light. Keir Starmer has always been very clear that he doesn't model himself on any politician or any of his predecessors. He has spoken to Tony Blair a great deal. He's spoken to Gordon Brown a great deal. He speaks to Neil Kinnock, speaks to Ed Miliband, speaks to many of his predecessors. And he takes advice from all of them and he listens to all of them. But I don't think on this occasion, given that Keir Starmer marched against the Iraq War, publicly opposed it, and then pursued through the courts the former Attorney General Lord Goldsmith for the detail of the legal advice he'd given to Tony Blair prior to the Iraq War for another 3 years. Given that that was Keir Starmer's record, I don't think Keir Starmer would be seeking necessarily to take advice from Tony Blair about Middle East military action.
All right, I've got to move on. Tom Baldwin, good to talk to you. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you.